So, yeah, 2 more Mondays after this, and then we'll be, coming together. But I think as I was thinking about these chapters this week, these are some of my favorite parts of the story. Just such great encouragement that God sees us, that He remembers, that He highlights even these little places in. Did the battery get funny? That He highlights these little places in our lives where we think everybody's forgotten. And so, yeah, I just am excited to go through this with you and talk about these verses and, be excited about the Word of God and what God speaks to us. So let's just pray before we do that. God, I thank you for who you are and for the way that you hold us and that you help us to navigate the waters of our lives, Lord. And sometimes we think we're going one way and the current shifts us somewhere else. And God, I just ask that you would help us to go with your current and not fight against it for where we thought we wanted to be. And Lord, whatever we've come from this morning, I just ask that you would bring peace over our hearts and remind us that you do work everything according to your purpose. That you've got this, whatever this is, and we can just leave it in your hands and just spend this next hour focused on who you are and the way that you want to speak into our hearts. Amen. Okay, so when we left off in chapter 4, Esther was going into this 3-day time of fasting. And, if you just think about the significance of the 3 days, the 3 days with Jesus, there's just a lot of tie-ins to that 3 days, like, Jonah and the whale and all these different things. So even just looking at that 3 days, so she spent those 3 days fasting, and then there was the day that she was going before the king. On that third day, she would have gotten changed and put on her royal robes. And I thought a lot about this week about what she was thinking as she went into the king. Like, obviously, she probably had some kind of strategy already going on. She probably expected him to hold out the golden scepter to her, but I'm sure there was still this part of her that was thinking, what if he doesn't? What if he says no? But she would have had to think, but God's not going to send me in there if he's going to say no. I mean, he definitely could have asked her to do that. And so I thought a lot about maybe the flip-flopping that was going on inside of her heart. And I'm sure that time of fasting and prayer really helped to settle her and gave her strength to even push aside some of that flip-flopping, back and forth, not being double-minded. We read those verses in the New Testament where it talks about not being double-minded, but just being steadfast on the Lord. And so I'm sure there was this component of her being steadfast that really came about through that time of fasting and the strengthening of the Lord, the courage that she had to go forth and to present her request to the king. But I wonder if when she was walking in there, she was thinking, I'm not even sure what I'm going to say. When I come here on Monday mornings, I have spent time in the Word, I've spent time studying, I've spent time praying, but honestly, I am never really sure what God is going to say until I get up here. I have stuff going on in my head. I don't ever have any notes. Sometimes I write some things down that are like factual bits of information, like time frames or people, those kind of factual things I want to make sure I give you the specific details on, but I've come in from this place of cultivating my heart and just allowing God to do what he does. That's how he's shown me to approach my life, and with the speaking that I do, it's the same thing. I've always felt him say, I want you to prepare your heart. That's the most important thing. Just prepare your heart and let me do the rest. And so for me, because that's been my experience, I kind of roll that over onto Esther and say, I wonder if that was her experience too, that she had just come from this amazing place of preparing her heart before the Lord. And then she was walking in there thinking, okay, God, I don't really know how you're going to work this all out. I know you're going to do something. And so I think there would have been this confidence that she walked in there with, but also this great shaking inside of herself, the presence of the Lord and also the reality of what she knew she was going to do. And so it says, now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms, and the king was sitting on the royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. And I don't know if you guys have watched, I'm not going to talk about VeggieTales yet. I know you thought I was going to say that. One Night with the King. I think the scene is very good for helping us to understand what it would have looked like in the court. The king would not have been by himself. It wasn't even like he just would have had one or two people with him. There were usually a lot of people with the king. And the whole reason that they didn't allow people to come in uninvited was because of the risk of assassinations. The king was always worried about the risk of someone coming to assassinate him. And so he had to grant them permission. It had to be somebody that he knew and would give permission to come into his court. So you would have had, I kind of imagine it based on that scene, like he's sitting up, on his throne, and there's people all along the corridor on both sides of him. And I'm not sure if that's really how it is, but I'm a visual person, and so I have that picture in my mind from the video, and that's kind of what I see. And so Esther is standing there, and he sees her, and he extends the scepter to her. And I have to think she must have taken a really deep breath. One, sigh of relief because he extended the scepter to her, but two, because now she had to approach the king. And so I almost wonder, what was going on in her head with every step that she took. And I have to believe that she had to be reciting some kind of promise that the Lord had given her, or something that God had really spoken to her heart. And for me, I love worship music, and the Lord really speaks to me through that and through the scriptures. And so when I'm walking into something really difficult, whether I've purposed to remember a song or not, usually the Lord is playing something that kind of becomes my anthem. So I'm wondering if there was an anthem going through her head, and there are times where I have to force there to be an anthem going through my head that is of God, because if I don't, it's the anthem of my fear or my worry or my anxiety. But to lean into God and say, God, you have given me these promises. This is what you've said in Scripture. This is what you've been speaking to my heart, and this is where I'm going to stand. So she starts to approach the king. And Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter, and the king said to her, "What is troubling you, Queen Esther, and what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be given to you." So he knew there was something going on. I mean, why would she walk in there if there wasn't a matter of life and death? Coming before the king was a matter of life and death. So there had to be something serious going on in front of her and in her mind to bring before the king. And the best way that I can think of to help you visualize that is, we all have somebody who comes to us, and oftentimes my kids come to me when I'm on the phone, and I'm like, do not come to me. Do not come to me when I'm on the phone, especially if I know I'm making an important call. I'll tell them, I really need you to be quiet right now. Back at the book release, I was doing a lot of radio interviews, and I still do some from time to time now. But man, I hated it when they would say that it had to be a time when my kids were home. I'm like, are you kidding me? How am I going to keep my house quiet? So I would go upstairs to one of my kids' closets, and I would sit in their closet upstairs because they were all downstairs. But I'd be like, whatever happens, if you are not bleeding, if this is not a reason to call 911, you do not interrupt me. And of course, there was that one time, and I'm like, your head is coming off or something. Just do not talk to me. But I knew that there has to be something important going on if somebody's coming. So I'm sure that that's what he was thinking. There has to be something really important going on if she's willing to risk it by walking in here. And when he said to her, even half of the kingdom, he wasn't saying to her, I'm going to give you half of everything I have. It was more of an expression in that time for the king. That was just his way of saying, hey, what is going on? Here's what I would give you. I trust you. I love you. I have this kind of relationship with you. Here's what I will do for you. But he wasn't saying to her, I'll give you half my kingdom. He was just making a point. It's like when we say, I would do anything for you. I would do anything for you. It was basically the same thing that he was saying to her. Esther, what do you need? I'll do anything for you. And I love that because I think there's so many times throughout these verses that we see him in not such a great way. We see the more arrogant, kind of stereotypical Old Testament king kind of guy. But I feel like there are glimpses of his heart and his tenderness towards her, and I think that we see that even in here. And Esther said, "If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I've prepared for him." Now, there would have been all those people in that courtroom with him. She wouldn't have wanted to say it all right there. She would have wanted to talk in a more private location. If I'm going to have a big conversation with my husband or with my kids, I'm not going to do it in the middle of the shopping mall. It's the same kind of thing. She wanted to be in a place that was private, that was more one-on-one. I think it was very interesting that she requested that Haman come too. Let's think about that. Okay, so he's the instigator for all these problems. He's the guy that caused all this trouble. Wow, was that ever brave? If I have to think about how I would have responded in this situation, I think that was totally the Lord. God was totally giving her the exact way to do this. My natural inclination would not have been to invite the guy that wanted to take my life. I think in our natural humanity, we would want to set it up without them. But it was such the Lord, the way that he laid this out. And I think that we see God so clearly in the way that he orchestrated how Esther asked the king, how she brought this matter before him, and all of the little things that happened along the trail to get there. And the king said, let's get Haman and let's go to the banquet that Esther has prepared. And as they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done." And Esther replied, My petition and my request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and to do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says." So she buys herself another day. She must have been feeling something in her spirit, okay, this is not the right time. I need to wait one more day. And I know there are times for me when I think that I'm going to do something and I don't, and I am kind of hard on myself afterwards. What was my problem? Am I just being a procrastinator? Am I just lazy? What is going on? Why didn't I just do this thing? And then there are times where then I see the beauty of what God's doing in what I thought was either just me being a procrastinator or some kind of delay. And we see that here. And so it makes me look at my life or my circumstances a little bit differently to say, okay, God, I want to give you the space to move. Because if she would have asked him after that first banquet, it might have been a completely different answer. But there's this really important event that happens between the first banquet and the second. And there are really important things that happen with Haman between the first and the second. And so she was giving God the space to move. She was being patient to the Lord's time frame and giving him the ability to do something in that waiting period. And I think for me, I need that reminder a lot that God does really important things in the waiting period, because I don't like to wait. I just like to know what needs to be done and do it. I don't want to have to wait for it to work out for everyone else. But sometimes, in this scenario, it probably wasn't about Esther being ready, and maybe it wasn't even about the king being ready, but it was about what was going to happen with Haman and what was going to happen with Mordecai. It really wasn't about Esther at all. And that's the thing I have to realize. It's not always about me. It's about whatever else is peripherally a part of that story, whatever else is going on. And I say that to encourage you, because if you're in this place where you're like, this isn't quite going the way I thought, or it seems to be taking a lot longer than I thought this would, it might just be that it's not about you, that it's about something else that is a component of whatever is going on, but it just needs to wait. And that speaks a lot of encouragement to me. That speaks peace to my type A personality. Okay, God, I'll choose to wait a little bit longer because I know that there are things that you're doing that I can't see right now. but I know that you're going to work it out all in the best timing." And then Haman went out glad and pleased of heart. He was like, "I'm a rock star. I mean, she invited the king and me." And we know that Haman has insecurities. We've seen that in the other verses. He has this place of insecurity where he needs other people's approval. Well, he just got invited by the queen to a party that she threw for him and the king. So, can you imagine how that made him feel? It's like, wow, I've got it all wrapped up. The queen invited me to the special banquet. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, and went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons, and every instance where the king had magnified him, and how he had promoted him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman also said, "Even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet that she had prepared, and tomorrow also I am invited by her with the king. Yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." And Zeresh his wife and all of his friends said to him, "Have a gallows 50 cubits high made in the morning, and ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it, and go joyfully with the king to the banquet." And the advice pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. So, I've never really thought about that part too much, except that this time I wanted to be able to say a little bit about that gallows, and I wanted to understand what that meant a little bit more. So I looked into it, because I'm picturing, like an Old West type scene, with the wooden thing and the rope, like you're going to hang somebody. That's kind of what I think when I read that. But that's not at all what it meant. First of all, it was 75 feet high. Like, he wanted everybody to be able to see this. He wanted them all to know what was going to happen. But when he talks about this was not a hanging like a rope. It was a pole, and the person was impaled on the pole up through the middle of their body. And they were stood on this pillar, basically, for everyone to see, and they died a very slow and torturous death. That's what he was doing for Mordecai. He was so consumed by his insecurity that he allowed one person to ruin his day. And he took that motivation of that insecurity and the anger that he felt to build that gallows. He asked his friends and his wife what they thought about all of this, and they encouraged him to feel what he was feeling in his heart. Instead of saying, don't let one person get you down. The king loves you. He's entrusted you. You're top man in the kingdom. The queen had you to the banquet. Nobody was a wise counsel for him. They all just fed into what he was already feeling. And I'm sure there was a reason for that. I'm sure Haman was the kind of guy who didn't double cross. And there might have been people thinking, why are you letting this get you down? But when you hear everybody else speaking in one way, you're not going to contradict them and say something else. And so, whenever I'm reading these chapters, I'm always thinking about the different kinds of people that we see in there. And the reminder for myself of not to be like that. Because, there are times where, one bad thing happens, and then I just take it out on everybody. I'll be honest. And my one son is particularly good at pointing that out to me. You're mad at them. Why are you yelling at me? You're right. I get that. I get why Haman had the potential to feel like that. Because he was so focused on that one bad thing that he allowed that to ruin everything else that was good about his life. I'm like that. I'm like Haman sometimes. I have the ability to miss everything else that's good because of this one thing, then that's all I can see. But I need people who aren't like Haman's friends. Obviously, it's more comfortable when we have somebody, and we're like, hey, I just need to vent a couple minutes. And they're like, yeah, I totally understand. That's so terrible. That's awful. You shouldn't be friends with them anymore. Unfriend them on Facebook. Like I'm trying to put this into our things we can relate to. But, when you can have the wise counsel of somebody else saying, you know what, you're thinking about this way too seriously. Don't take it so personally. Just take a deep breath and let it go. Think about all the other people you have in your life that are so supportive. Like for me, Dan is really good at this. And it's not like I'm this huge whiner, but there are times when I'm like, why is it like this? Why? Why can't this be different? Whatever. And I don't know if it's just because he has such a different perspective being a man, but he's really good at listening to what I say and seeing truth in it when I just see emotion. And I really appreciate that. I've learned to appreciate that, and I've learned to respond better and not take that personally. To say, okay, I need to look at what's truth out of this and not be swayed by emotion. And yeah, sometimes there are people in our lives that just aren't going to be our friends. And maybe they were our friends in one season, and we saw that friendship for the gift that it really was, and we wanted them to be our friend forever. And maybe that's not just how the plan went, and we have to let it go. And to say, okay, I'm not going to allow this one person or this one aspect of my life to infringe upon all the rest of it. God, help me to see the good stuff that you've planted in such a way that it overshadows the other things. Let me not become consumed by the difficult places in my life, but let me enjoy the beauty of everything else that you're doing. Because I truly think that our lives are based on our perspective. Whatever we're capable of seeing, that's what life will be. And I don't say that in a way to just say like, oh, forget about it. Like, don't feel the pain of that, or don't allow yourself to experience that. I'm not saying that at all. Like, I am totally about being real before the Lord and allowing him to bring healing into our hearts for the places where we have been wounded and broken. Totally about that. But we have to be willing to see life from that perspective of redemption of God. To say, okay, this is what I see in my flesh right now. This is what I see going on right here. But God, I have to believe that you're going to do something to redeem that. And it doesn't always look like, the hallmark ending of what we would want. It's not always like a happy resolution, but he always does something greater with it than we could have ever anticipated. And I know that I've said this before. Sometimes the very thing that we're asking the Lord to do for us is the very thing that he asks us to do for someone else. But had we not had the longing that we felt inside of our hearts, we wouldn't have known how to respond in a way that meant something to someone else. And there's this place of being filled by God that's not about our circumstances. It's not about one thing ever changing, but just allowing him to be present in our pain. And to allow that pain to be a motivating factor that encourages us to make a difference in someone else's life. And for me, coming from this place of great pain, and tragedy in my own life, to be able to come to the place of speaking into someone else's life, to say, look, God's done this miraculous thing in my life. I wouldn't have ever anticipated that my life could be this beautiful. 8 years ago when my life was wrecked and I was a widow and my kids didn't have a dad and my husband chose to leave like that, if you would have said, fast forward 8 years and you're going to have this wonderful husband and these amazing kids and you're going to be adopting, I wouldn't have thought that was possible. Because that's God. But if he's done this work in my life, if he's brought this story of redemption to me, what does he want to do for you? And maybe for you, it's not going to look like speaking to groups of women or whoever, but he's got something for you, even in the midst of your pain, in the midst of the brokenness that you've known, however that looks in your life. it changes the way that you see things. It changes the way that you see the world. It changes the way that you see other people. And it gives you the ability to see people in your same situation. And to say, look, you don't have to do this alone, and I understand what that feels like. You know, some of the most powerful words we can say to someone else is, I know what it feels like to be broken. Even if the circumstances aren't the same, like, I know what it feels like to be broken. And what a comfort that is when we hear those words. It's not a pressure to fix something. It just comes from that place of being faithful to the Lord and being willing to step out in whatever we know to touch someone else's life. You know, and as I look across this room, I don't know you individually all like super well. I don't know all the places of your pain and your struggle, but I know some of you. And I know what you've come from. And I know that that's not the definition of your life. And I know that that wasn't God's desire for you. It wasn't his desire for you to feel pain like that, for you to know the brokenness that you've known. But I know that he's not going to leave you there. And it's the beauty of who he is and the way he works inside of us that he writes this amazing redemption story. That he can take what we've known and use it to touch the life of someone else. And I can't even begin to tell you how that feels inside. And it's not that you do it because it feels good. It's this other thing that happens that you're not even expecting. Because in the moment when you're reaching out to someone and you're saying, I know what that feels like. I know what loss feels like. You're not thinking, I'm doing this because it's going to make me feel better. But you find that on the other side. And there's this bond that God creates when we're willing to reach out to someone else that's in a broken place, where our brokenness becomes a bond that links us together and it's strong. And you can have only known someone for 5 minutes but have shared something really deep with them and have a much different relationship than someone that you've known for 20 years but hardly gone beneath the surface. Because you know you can trust them. You know that they understand you, that you understand them, that you can just look at each other's eyes and know. Like, you don't have to ask questions about how you're doing. You can just know from looking at each other. That's just God. That he brings us to this place where our brokenness doesn't define us, but it empowers us to be used by God for greatness. Because he loves us and he wants more for us than whatever we've known. He wants to take us to this place that is far beyond whatever we could have comprehended, to say, God, I never would have seen that coming, but I love it. I love what you've done. I love what you're doing, and I love that you're not done yet. Like, he's not finished writing the story of any of our lives. And sometimes we're ready for a new page or a new chapter, but he's not finished. There's so much yet to be done. And so I think about that when I read these chapters, especially in the way that the tables get turned on Haman. And when we get into the section where, the king asks for this book, what he's reading happened 5 years ago. So if you're sitting here this morning and you're thinking about places where you feel like you've been let down because you were faithful to the Lord or you stepped out in obedience and nothing ever really seemed to happen from that, it's not forgotten. And Mordecai was from the Benjaminites. Like, he was one of them. They're referred to as the smallest, the least. Like, over and over and over, when you read about the tribe of Benjamin, they're little guys. And they weren't like always good guys either. There's a lot of drama about them. But they were small. And I love that. Like, I love when I'm reading through the pages of the Word and I see something about the tribe of Benjamin, because I'm like, yay for the little guy, I like rooting for the underdog. And I think for me, a lot of times in my life, I felt like the little guy. The one that got missed or whatever. It's really easy to identify with that. And God does not miss the little guy. Like, you don't get hidden by all the big guys. He sees you. He saw Mordecai, And he brought the remembrance of this, like, right at the right time. Like, his timing is spot on. Mordecai never needed to be remembered by the king, but this one time. And had he been remembered by the king any other time, it wouldn't have set him up for what happened. This one time, this one night. It says, during the night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Like, the king could do anything he wanted. He wanted somebody to read him a story, you know? That is a tactic that we use in our house. I have one particular child who likes me to tuck him in, like, I don't know how many times a night. Like, come back in 5 minutes. Come back in 5 minutes. And sometimes I'll be like, hey, Dan, can you go tell him a story? And that always seems to work. I am not a good storyteller of my, like, he wants to hear stories from childhood. I, like, played it by the book. I don't have anything exciting to tell a boy. You know, I liked to jump off of walls with my umbrella and pretend to be Mary Poppins. Like, wow, that's wild. I got locked in a shed one time with the cats, and my parents thought I was out playing, and I was, like, stuck in the shed, and I couldn't get out for a couple hours. Wow, that's exciting. You know, I don't really have any. Dan's got these stories of, like, where he flew off the handlebars of a motorcycle, or, I don't know, like his car was on fire. You know, and I always tell Dan, if I had known you then, we would not know each other now. Because I was, like, by the book, and he was anything but the book. So I'll say, like, hey, can you go tell Carson a story? So I think it's interesting that the king, he was like, hey, I want somebody to come tell me a story. Come read to me from these chronicles. And as God would have it, it's this time period from 5 years before. And it was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, and they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And you know from the Veggie Tales, you know, like they had that piano. Had to sneak that in somewhere. And the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? Like, hey, this guy saved my life. What did I do about that? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. Okay, so here's what we know about that night. Mordecai was mad. He went home. Everybody was like, build a gallows. Let's get rid of, or Haman was mad. He went home, like, let's build a gallows, get rid of Mordecai. He must have had that constructed during the night. He wasn't sleeping either. The king doesn't sleep. He has this book read. Remember, everybody had said to Haman, in the morning, go ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. So I think he was probably like waiting until it was the crack of dawn to go in and talk to the king. So the king's up. He just has read this, you know, had this passage read to him. And he can hear somebody out, you know, outside of his room. He can hear somebody's out there. So he said, who's in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. Like, that guy moves fast. A 75-foot, like, thing to impale and crucify Mordecai on, he got that built in one night? Wow, he moved fast. And the king said to him, behold, Haman is standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. This part is like, oh man, this is so good. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what is to be done for a man whom the king desires to honor? And Haman says to himself, who would the king desire to honor more than me? And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man who the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before them, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. Now, of course, this is where I see the Veggie Tale playing out in my mind. You know, Haman leading Mordecai on this horse through the town, saying, this is how the king delights to honor those who please him, while he has the thing built in his front yard. And the king said to Haman, "Take quickly the robes and the horse you have said, and do this for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate, and do not fall short in anything you have said." Ouch. I can't even imagine what Haman was thinking as he walked out of there. And the king knew that Mordecai was a Jew. I mean, I'm thinking in my head, the king made this decree, that Mordecai or Haman had come before him and said, let's get rid of all the Jews. And the king made this decree about that. And now he's saying to honor Mordecai the Jew. Wow. And it's that whole thing about God exalting the humble. Mordecai had never looked for honor in that. He was just doing what he was supposed to do. He was being faithful. He was looking out for the king. He wasn't looking for honor and glory, but God honored him in a super significant way. And I mean, imagine if the king had asked anybody else but Haman, "How should I honor somebody?" What would they have said? I don't know. And it's not just that it's the irony of this happening, but it's the way God works it out, where I'm like, God, even if you would have written this story and it all would have turned out and this part just wouldn't have been there, it still would have been amazing and we would still be able to glean so much from that. But then to have it happen like this? Seriously? God, you just don't miss anything. And that encourages me. He just doesn't miss a thing. He works it all out at the right time with the wrong people. Haman does not look like the right guy to have this story worked out through. But God works it out at the right time, and he even uses what we think are the wrong people. If that doesn't give me encouragement for my life, what would? It's just because that's who God is. And it doesn't mean that you have to be living in this place where you feel like you're being an Esther, all valiant and courageous. It just means that you're being faithful to the Lord. And, I've thought a lot about, what was Esther's responsibility in this? Her responsibility was not to be successful. Her responsibility was to be faithful to the Lord and obedient. And it's made me challenge myself. How many times do I go into a situation feeling like I have to be successful? But I don't think God sees success like we do. Because I don't think that he's as much concerned about the circumstances as he is concerned about our heart. So for me, really being successful before the Lord is something that happens in my heart. It's not something that plays out in circumstances. And I think that has the power to rock my world like nothing else. That I don't have to look like I'm successful to be successful before the Lord. And if I'll allow the Lord to define my success, it doesn't matter what my circumstances look like. How much freedom is there in that? That my success today is not maintained by whether or not I do 4 loads of laundry or feel like I led a great study or have a snack and a drink when I pick Carson up from school, although he'd really like it if I did. There are all these things that I'm if I remember to do all of them, that looks like success to me. But really, success is not tied up in that at all. It's about, where was my heart in all of that? Was I stressed and frustrated and just moving from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next? Was I just rushing through it all to get it all done? Cross off my list by 9 o'clock and say, I'm successful. Or was I looking for opportunities to connect in the midst of that? To connect with my kids, to have something left to connect with my husband when the day's over, to connect with people that God puts in my path between now and then. Success happens in our hearts and between us and the Lord. But I think the hard part is when we come from this place of wanting to look like we're successful. Do I not want to look like I'm successful? Well, sure I do. But I can't live my life based on hoping to hit everyone else's expectations of my success. I have to live my life based on what God says is success. So who cares if I'm late or I forget about 2 of those loads of laundry? if I did it from a place where my heart was connected to God and then empowered to connect with others, that's wildly more successful. It's not about our to-do list. It's about God's list. Like, what's at the top of his list for us today? Connecting with him, having an intimate relationship with him, looking for him to speak into our lives, expecting his redemption. That's at the top of his list. That was at the top of his list for Esther. I don't think she went in there with this heaviness, this weight of the responsibility to save all these people is on me. She went in to convey the heart of the Lord. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home, mourning with his head covered. And Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Because they would have been waiting at his house. What happened when you went in to talk to the king today? What happened when you told him about Mordecai? What did he say? Well, they probably already knew, that they probably were hanging out there waiting to hear, and then they saw him coming around, in this parade. Here is how the king honors a man that's pleasing to him. And they're like, what the heck happened? What on earth happened from the time you left until you got here? What went down? And I'm thinking, their mouths must have been chattering, and I don't know, they must have been on high alert. I need to know the story. Give me the details. What's going on? He couldn't text them and say, things are not going according to plan. It couldn't be worse. Major train wreck. I don't know. They were waiting to hear the news. And so he told them. And then his wise men and Zeresh his wife said to him, if Mordecai, before you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. This guy had a big day. He went to the king super early in the morning after he'd probably been up all night, overseeing the building of this thing. And he went to the king to try to get rid of Mordecai. Did not work. He ends up parading him around town all day. Goes home, he's in the middle of telling everybody what happened, and then the guys come and get him to take him to the party. Whew, he had a whirlwind of a day, and it's not going to get any better. So then as we start into chapter 7, now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen, and they drank their wine at the banquet. And the king said, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even half of the kingdom, it shall be done. And Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as a petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, and to be killed, and to be annihilated. And if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king. And King Ahasuerus asked Esther, who is he, and where is he, and who would presume to do this? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. And Haman became terrified before the king and queen. Can you imagine how much passion was in her voice as she spoke? If you went to someone and you were pleading for your family or your friends, she was pleading for all the Jews across these 127 provinces. She'd spent those 3 days fasting, and then she went before the king, and now we're at the second day of that. How much passion was inside of her heart to speak for them? And I know we only see a couple sentences here, but I think it probably went much further than that. And I think the king felt her heart. She had prepared her heart before the Lord, and now the Lord was speaking from her heart. And Haman, what was he thinking? And I'm sure as she starts to say, I and my people, he's like, oh my goodness, the queen is a Jew too. If it wasn't bad enough, it was Mordecai. Because he's already he had just come from his house, and the wise men and his wife were like, hey, if this is about Mordecai and you've already fallen, like, there's no way you're going to win this. And now he's like, this isn't even just about Mordecai, it's about the queen. The king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. So the king is so mad, he's like, I just need to get a breath of fresh air. I mean, can you imagine how he felt? He had trusted Haman. Haman was like top dog in the kingdom. He was above all the other princes and everyone. Like, there was a relationship built between the two of them, and he had totally stabbed the king in the back. And I'm sure that the king, knew that there was going to be some kind of decree or something coming down against Haman, but I'm sure there was all of that going on in his head. And so he's like, I just need to get a breath of fresh air. I need to think through this or whatever. He walks out into the garden. And now when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. He was pleading for his life. He wanted her to do something, but it didn't look like that. To the king, who's already upset because of what Haman has done, it looks like something very different. And the king said, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? And as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the eunuchs who was before the king, said, behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Wow. And as much as Esther was preparing to save her people and knowing that, she was risking everything to go before the king, could she have ever envisioned that that was going to mean taking Haman down like that? Wow. I don't know. I guess for me, there's so much significance in these two chapters, it's almost hard to wrap my mind around all of it at once. The preparation that Esther made and her willingness to go before the king, and what mantle the Lord had placed on her for her to respond to. And then also the way that Haman gets taken out. And the whole thing with Mordecai, that's just crazy to me. And I just love the Lord. I love the way he does that. Because don't we all want the good guy to win? And could you have crafted a story like that? If this was up to you to figure out, would you ever have thought to do it that way? I mean, it just shows me over and over again that God sees the whole picture. And he has the ability to intertwine all of it. Obviously, it was not in God's heart for Haman to, establish this thing to get rid of Mordecai on. But it becomes part of the story. God, he brings the story back around, and Haman is now executed on this whole thing that he made. God sees all of it, and he works it all together, even with people that aren't working for him. And it gives me hope, not just for my life, but in the world that we live in today. If you look at Facebook or the news station, whatever, it's all consumed by all these crazy things that are going on in the world and how it might affect us. But then I'm balanced by looking at the pages of the Word and seeing the way that God orchestrates every detail and how he saves his people and so much more. This was complete. There wasn't any component of this that was left hanging. He pulls in all the loose strings and ties them up. And he didn't just do that for Esther or for the Jews. He does that in all of our lives. And I think so much of the time we don't even know it's happening. We don't see all these circumstances where, stuff is rising up against us or whatever. We don't see that. we're shielded by the Lord from understanding some of the backstory. But yet in the midst of that, he works this amazing plan that he has for each one of us. And Esther was just this normal girl. She started out life as this normal girl from this small tribe, nothing of consequence, nothing of significance. She didn't necessarily want to be in the place she found herself. There were long days, and there was a time of really setting her heart before the Lord and being willing to allow him to do something with circumstances that weren't under her control, that weren't what she ever would have wanted, but he does. And he does that for each one of us. And I was talking to Dan last night and saying, if I look back across my life and try to think about times where I had to be really brave and courageous, there were times when I just knew that I had to do what I had to do, and I couldn't even think about how I felt about it or what I didn't want to do. And it required much more strength from me than I ever thought I had, but strength that God had obviously put there and I never knew to look for, because I'd never been in a place to need what he had buried deep inside. But I also think about places where I had to make a choice that I can see the beauty of now that I didn't know then. And I'm sure there were voices that were discouraging Esther. I'm sure there were people that were discouraging her from walking out the plan God had for her. But she centered in on the voice of the Lord. And I think most specifically about when I made the choice to marry Dan, because there were a lot of people who thought it was too soon, thought I was making a really big mistake. I think the voices of opposition were definitely louder than the voices of support. And it was very hard for me. It was very hard because I wasn't just wildly in love and thinking this is going to be fabulous and beautiful and I'm going to ride off in the sunset. I had 3 kids and I was much more concerned about them than I was myself. But I knew that they needed a father. And I knew that God was bringing this man, that he had brought this man into our lives. And I had to trust that I was making the right decision, even if other people didn't think that I was. And I'm an emotional person. And so when I read the pages of Esther, it makes me think about the experiences of my life. And it also makes me think forward into the future. And, the attitudes and the way that I want to carry my heart before the Lord. But it makes me thankful for the times that I've gone out on a limb with God, because he hasn't let me down. And it's not that it was easy. I remember laying awake at night and thinking am I making a huge mistake? God, I can't be. I know that I can't be. I know this is you. And I don't know why they don't know this is you, but I do. And God, I'm willing to risk being wrong because I'm sure that you're right. I hate being wrong. When I was a kid, I didn't raise my hand in class because even though I was 99% sure I knew the answer, there was that 1% chance I could be wrong. I didn't want to look stupid. And so this was the time of my life where I was risking it all really big. And I knew that I wasn't just risking it for myself, but I was risking it for my kids. But I thought, you know what, God, the beauty of what I feel you've promised me is worth way more than what I'm risking. And I know that I want to be obedient to you regardless of all else. And so I want to walk this out with you. I want to trust you. And so the song that the Lord really put on my heart this week was a song that really spoke to me in that time, and it's called The Stand. And I just remember Dan and I had been dating, and we got engaged, and we had bought this house. And at first I was like, no, I'm not going to move into the house until we move in together. I want to live there together. But a week before settlement, I decided that I was going to move. Because I'm just like that. So I was like packing up my house with 3 little kids a week before settlement. And so there were a lot of nights that after the kids went to bed, I was like in the garage sorting boxes and working on stuff. And I was always listening to some music. And so I was listening to this particular Hillsong United CD. And this song came on, and I so remember standing in my garage with all these cardboard boxes and just having my hands out to the Lord and embracing all of the words of that song and what I felt like this was costing me, because of the weight that I knew from the discouragement of others, and also because, I've seen enough. I know what I'm getting into. I know what we're doing, and I know the potential. I know. But I just felt the Lord encouraging my heart that I just needed to surrender it to Him. I didn't have to have any answers. I just needed to be willing to allow Him to work that out. And so if you're in a place this morning where you can either think about past experiences or something you're going through now or whatever, even if you're not going through something right now that causes you to have to make a big decision for the Lord, there's going to be something. And so I just would ask you to put yourself and put your heart in a place where you can connect with the Lord, and He can encourage you, and He can strengthen you, and He can prepare you for whatever that is. Because what I know of God is that we don't just end up somewhere totally unprepared for whatever choice He's asked us to make. He leads us there. He leads us, and He uses the things in our lives that weren't even Him to prepare us for that moment. I can look back on my life and say, God, I don't know how you did it, but you used everything I ever went through to prepare me for what I had to go through, because you're good like that. And so all these insignificant days are preparation. And so allow Him to prepare your heart. And I'm not saying that it's going to be this scary, tragic, awful thing. I don't want to instill anxiety and fear in anyone, because whatever God allows in your life, He'll give you the ability to walk through, and He'll do it victoriously. You don't have to be afraid. But we have to have our hearts settled before Him. We have to allow Him to come and to speak and to ignite our passion, to cause us to be able to stand. And so that's what I want for you this morning. So ladies, for those of you who are here this morning and you came with a problem that you really don't see the end to, or you really don't see the way out, I just want to say to you, God's not done, and He always has a solution, and I love that about the Lord. I love that He always has a way to figure it out. He's got it. We just need Him to reveal it to us. And we need to be willing to look at it from His perspective. We see it right here. We see it just from the surface, but He sees all of it. He saw all of that. He saw what Haman was doing. He saw the way that the king needed to be reminded about Mordecai. He saw that, and he worked it out. I would never have thought of that. The way He did it just would never have crossed my mind. Because God's ways are not our ways. His plans are not our plans. And He sees everything from this other perspective that we just can't even imagine. But He's got it. Whatever you're going through right now, He's got the solution for you. Just don't stop. Don't stop looking for it. And don't stop expecting that God is going to do something. He's not just going to leave you in this place. I know I said it last week, but He hasn't brought you this far to let you down now. You can trust Him. You don't have to be able to see it to know that it's going to happen. You can trust Him. And so as you go into your time of small groups this morning, here are the 3 things that I would say if you need some ideas of what to talk about. One, you can certainly ask questions or continue to discuss the reading from this past week. If there's something you want to talk about from that, something that stuck out to you, something that you want to hear someone else's perspective of, talk about the scripture. Two, talk about a place that you are at where you need to see the Lord move. Like, be willing to share that with each other in a way that they can pray for you, that they can uphold you. But, let's be careful of the way that we do that, that we're not just like being gossipy or mean about someone else. And three, give a testimony to a place where God has brought you from, where you have seen him do that, where you have seen him work something out. And it doesn't have to be this like amazing, huge thing. It can just be, last week when I was coming here, my friend was visiting, and she didn't know quite how to get to the church. And we saw each other at the intersection. And so she was able to follow me in. And, last week I got here really late because my kids were home, and I had to pick up one of them, and, that whole mom thing. And so what I thought was late was so right on time, because there she was, and she could just follow me. And that was totally the Lord. So share a testimony, just share a way that you can encourage others of what you've seen God do in your own life or in someone else's life. So I just want to pray for you before we go out into our small group time. God, I thank you that you are here, like you're with us. And you're not just with us now, but you're with us always. And God, I ask that you would help us to position our hearts in front of you, that you can speak to them, that you can speak life to us, that you can ignite our dreams and show us that we're not just these circumstances that have happened to us, but that you have so much more for us beyond that. God, I ask that you would bring healing to our places of brokenness, that you would give us vision, that you would give us wisdom, and that you would give us purpose. God, help us to do whatever you've asked us to do that's right in front of us, to do whatever we think is possible, and to allow you to inspire us to do what we would even think is impossible. God, we know that with you, everything's possible. And Lord, I ask that the presence that we receive from you would be so strong that this world would not be able to extinguish the flame. That we would continue to look for you and to expect you at every moment in our regular, ordinary lives, because you're here. And you have this awesome ability to do something extraordinary with what we simply thought was ordinary. So God, I ask that you would be with us in our small group time and as we go from here. And Lord, I just pray a special blessing over the child care workers today. Amen.